Hello, this is Amy Caruso, Head of Collateral Initiatives at ISDA. I'd like to provide an overview of resources available to ISDA members and their counterparties on the ISDA website in a section called Margin Info Hub. So first, go to ISDA.org, and then you'll click on the Margin tab. You'll see here that there is documentation resources, ISDA SIM or Standardized Initial Margin Methodology resources, and then also the Info Hub. Within the Info Hub, we have 4 sections: ANA and self-disclosure, calculating initial margin, segregation and eligible collateral, and initial margin implementation and processes. First, to determine if you are in or out of scope, we have a guide called UMR by the numbers. It includes information about ANA, or the average aggregate notional amount, which is based on legal entities and their consolidated group. In this document, there's also information about the initial margin threshold, which is counterparty to counterparty, and minimum transfer amounts. Now, because each regulatory regime or jurisdiction isn't exactly the same with ANA calculation methodologies or compliance dates and periods, we have a document or a chart that reviews that. And the U.S. has some very specific elements to calculating their ANA for Phase 5 and Phase 6, and we have a document that reviews those items. Now, there's 2 types of initial margin calculation methodologies. There's SIM, otherwise known as the Standardized Initial Margin Methodology, and GRID, or also known as Schedule. Now, we have a document here and in another section that reviews some details around GRID notional and tenor and calculating your initial margin and determining in or out of scope for that initial margin threshold. Once you've determined you're in scope and your counterparty relationships need to be communicated to, we have 3 resources here: the ANA self-disclosure letter and answer sheet that is available via the ISDA bookstore, multilateral self-disclosure exercise. This is where you and counterparties can disclose to ISDA, and we manage a very careful communication only to those entities who are participating in that disclosure process. And then because the U.S. does have some nuances of the self-disclosure and the ANA calculations, we have a specific self-disclosure letter that includes CFTC, prudential regulators, and SEC margin requirements. Now, a few years ago, we did conduct an industry-level survey to determine how many entities and counterparty relationships would be in scope for the later phase, which at that time was just Phase 5, but we have broken that down now to Phase 5 and Phase 6 entities. Now, going on to the next section, the initial margin calculation, or calculating initial margin as it's stated here, we have 2 documents, one that I already mentioned, the GRID notional and tenor survey results, but also an overview of SIM and GRID and how you can determine what might fit best for your legal entity with your counterparty relationships and what you need to do to prepare for both of those types of calculations. The third section is segregation and eligible collateral. There are 2 types of structures for segregation: tri-party and third party. We have a written overview, we have an audio podcast, and then we also have a third party and tri-party onboarding and KYC checklist. We developed this with SIFMA AMG. And then we also have a suggested operational practice. This really focuses on workflows and streamlining the process of communicating margin calls, settlement instructions, and reporting to and from tri-party and third-party custodians. Now, one process that we encourage is automation of your release of collateral. So in a segregated account structure, when a collateral needs to be released back to the pledgor out of the segregated account, we encourage automation of that process. So again, we have a recorded audio podcast here. We also have a much more detailed recorded webinar with some subject matter experts in the industry. And then we have an AZITSI third-party custodian cash and security segregated collateral market practice. And that is published by another trade association, but we have it here. That's the International Securities Association for Institutional Trade Communication. And it focuses very specifically on the SWIFT messaging standards to use when automating that release of collateral process. The next item here, we worked with our custodians as well, our custodian members, to develop a notice of exclusive control, otherwise known as pledge or access notice workflow. So in the event, hopefully not, but in the event, if one of your counterparties should default, there's a very specific process that you should have in place ready to notify your custodians. Similar to the ANA calculation not being exactly the same with every regulatory regime, eligible collateral is not always the same with every jurisdiction. So we have a comparison chart here. And then to help firms manage the eligible collateral schedule negotiation process, we've developed templates with tri-party providers and also for your third-party structure. Depending on which you should use, you can start with these eligible collateral schedule templates. There's 10 available depending on your and your counterparty's regulatory regimes and your counterparty risk management of what types of collateral you wish to post and receive. So you can click on that for more information. And the last section of the ISDA Margin Info Hub is the initial margin implementation and processes section. So first we have a document called Getting Ready for Initial Margin, the steps to take. It outlines the 8 high-level steps to having a successful UMR implementation plan. Then, similar to ANA and eligible collateral, not all the jurisdictions or regulatory regimes are the same when it comes to products. So here we have an in-scope product chart that compares those regulatory regimes. And if you're subjected to more than one regulatory regime or jurisdiction, we have equivalence determinations for non-cleared margin requirements. Now, your attorneys on your team are probably going to be most interested in the next 3 documents. One is Where to Begin. It's a very detailed guide to initial margin documentation, both counterparty and tri-party provider documentation. Then we have a user's guide, also available in the ISDA bookstore, that overviews the 2018 and 2019 regulatory initial margin documentation, and then a summary of ISDA initial margin documentation, that's counterparty documentation. Now, we've talked about ANA and initial margin thresholds. BCBSI OSCO provided recommendations that you don't have to have documentation in place until you exceed that initial margin threshold. Well, this document kind of takes you through a little more detail of that recommendation. And we have a very tactical implementation project checklist and controls. You can use that as a guide for your project planning. We have 2 suggested operational practices. One that is everything around OTC derivatives collateral process. So not just initial margin or UMR focus, but it has been recently updated in 2021 to include those components. We also have an initial margin dispute processing suggested operational practice. And then if you are already posting independent amounts with your counterparties, you need to manage that along with the regulatory initial margin. So we have an audio recording or podcast and a written overview of how to manage the approaches. Next, we have 2 tactical items. One is a consensus list that was developed by our Margin and Collateral Processing Working Group around risk monitoring. So concentration limits, wrong way risk limits, and also how to manage haircuts. The next item is our trade lifecycle events guidance. So is a trade in or out of scope for uncleared margin and initial margin if you have a lifecycle event? Second to last is if you plan on posting cash and reinvesting into a money market fund, you'll be interested in this suggested operational practice. It was developed with our working group members, especially custodians who are doing this process already. And then last in the Margin Info Hub, we have a document called Beyond Brexit. It provides an overview of the EU and the UK margin rules for OTC derivatives. I hope you found this overview helpful. If you have any additional suggestions, feel free to contact me, Amy Caruso, at acaruso@isda.org. And also, we hope that you share this information with your colleagues, your counterparties, and your clients.